My name is Mike, and for the past few days my life has become some kind of weird nightmare that I can't figure out. It all started last Tuesday when my wife Emma came home from work. She looked flustered, her cheeks slightly flushed and her eyes sparkling in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. I was sitting on the sofa leafing through my phone when she walked into the living room, threw her bag on the armchair and just blurted it out. She said she was pregnant, just like that, without any introduction, without any preparation. I froze, staring at her, trying to comprehend the words that had just come out of her mouth. Pregnant. The word hung in the air between us, heavy as a brick, and I felt something inside me clench. I didn't know what to say. My heart raced, but not with joy, but with some strange, cold feeling that I couldn't immediately recognize. Emma stood there, looking at me with that weak smile, waiting for my reaction, but I just stayed silent. I had a whirlwind of thoughts going through my head, and none of them were happy ones. You see, the thing is, I can't have children. I'm infertile. This isn't an assumption, not some vague worry, it's a fact, confirmed by doctors years ago when Emma and I were trying to have a baby. We went through all those analyses, tests, humiliating conversations in sterile offices. In the end, I was told my chances of becoming a father naturally were zero. Zero. It was like a punch in the gut, but I accepted it. Emma and I accepted it, or at least I thought we'd both accepted it. She was still standing in front of me, and I saw her smile start to fade when I didn't answer right away. I forced myself to squeeze out something like, "Wow, that's unexpected," but my voice sounded muffled, like someone else was speaking. Emma must have taken it as a shock in a good way, because she came over to me, sat next to me, and started telling me how she'd taken the test this morning and then gone to the doctor to confirm. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks pregnant. I nodded, pretending to listen, but my mind was already counting weeks, dates, moments. 6 weeks ago was January, cold and gray like most of our lives this year. I tried to remember what was going on then, but all that came to mind was our usual routine: work, the house, the rare evenings when we ordered food and watched something on Netflix. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that could explain it. I stared at her as she spoke, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Emma looked genuinely excited, her hands shaking slightly as she talked about how she'd almost dropped the test in the sink out of nervousness. She'd always been like that, a little clumsy when she was worried, and it was one of the things I loved her for. We'd been married for 7 years, together for over a decade, and I thought I knew her better than anyone, but in that moment, looking at her, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. How could this be possible? How could she be pregnant if I couldn't be the father? My mind clung to logical explanations, but none of them held. Maybe the doctors were wrong? Maybe my tests were wrong? But that was unlikely. They'd tested me twice, and both times the result had been the same. Then what? A miracle? I'm not religious, but even if I was, it seemed too convenient to believe. Then another thought popped into my head, dark and sharp as a knife. I pushed it away, trying to focus on what Emma was saying, but it wouldn't go away. The thought grew, growing louder until it drowned out everything else. What if the baby isn't mine? I felt the blood rush from my face, and I had to turn away so she wouldn't notice. Emma was still talking, something about vitamins and the first doctor's appointment, but I wasn't listening anymore. My mind was somewhere else, going through memories, looking for clues I might have missed. Was there something strange about her behavior over the last couple of months? She was sometimes late to work, but she always explained it away with projects, and I never questioned it. She had calls that she took in another room, but I thought they were just friends or colleagues. I trusted her, completely, or at least I thought I did. I didn't sleep much that night. Emma went to bed early, curled up with a smile on her face, and I lay next to her, staring at the ceiling. The darkness pressed down on me, and my mind wouldn't stop. I remembered every little thing over the last 6 weeks. Had she been on the phone too long? Were there any strange messages that she quickly cleared away when I entered the room? I tried to convince myself that it was paranoia, that I was making up things that weren't there, but doubt had already taken root. I felt like a traitor for even thinking about it, but how could I not? The facts weren't adding up. I'm infertile, she's pregnant, and there was a huge gap between those two things that I couldn't fill. The next day, I pretended everything was fine. We had breakfast together and Emma looked so happy, humming to herself as she made toast. I smiled and nodded, even joked about probably having to learn how to change nappies, but inside I was falling apart. I couldn't ask her straight out, not yet. I needed more time to realize what was going on, to collect my thoughts, but the more I thought, the more questions I had. Who is the father? Did I know him? Was this a one-time event or something more? And, worst of all, how long had she kept this from me? I felt like an idiot, a blind fool who hadn't noticed what was happening right under his nose. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to do something, to find answers. I started paying attention to the little things, the way she left her phone on the table with the screen down, the quick nothing much response when I asked what she'd been up to. I hated myself for it, for becoming so suspicious, but I couldn't stop. Last night, while she was showering, I did something I never thought I would do for the first time. I took her phone. My hands shook as I entered the password, the date of our wedding, and the screen lit up. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I had to find something. Messages, calls, anything. I scrolled through a few chats with her friends. Nothing out of the ordinary, just chatter about work and weekend plans. But then I noticed a name that stood out. Jake, a colleague of hers. The same Jake she said was helping her with some big project last month. The messages were short, but there were a lot of them, and most of them sent late at night. Are you home? Can't talk right now. See you tomorrow. Nothing explicit, but enough to make my stomach twist. I heard the water in the shower turn off and quickly put the phone back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought she'd hear. When Emma came out, wrapped in a towel, I pretended to watch TV, but I couldn't meet her gaze. She went to bed and I stayed seated, staring at the blank screen. Now I couldn't stop thinking about this Jake guy. I'd seen him a couple of times at company parties, tall, confident, the type of guy who always knows what to say. I never thought of him as a threat, but now I'm not sure about anything. I'm going to dig deeper tomorrow. I need to know the truth, even if it destroys me. I woke up the next morning with a heavy head and feeling like I hadn't slept at all. Emma had already left for work, leaving a note on the kitchen table. Left early. See you tonight. Love you. I looked at those words, written in her neat handwriting, and felt a mixture of anger and guilt. Love you. Those words seemed so empty to me now, so fake, though I still wasn't sure if I was right in my suspicions. But I couldn't just sit around and wait for the truth to come out. I needed to act, and I decided to start with what I had: a name. Jake. It was all I had, but it should have been enough to start digging. I work from home, doing freelance design work, so I had plenty of time and freedom to devote a day to my little investigation. The first thing I did was open my laptop and start searching for Jake on social media. Emma had mentioned his full name, Jake Thompson, a couple of times when talking about his work, so I typed that into the search engine along with the name of her company. Not a minute later, I found his LinkedIn profile. There he was, grinning in a photo in a business suit, listing jobs and projects that sounded impressive. He worked with Emma in the same department, managing some kind of marketing campaign. There was nothing suspicious about the profile itself, but that only fueled my curiosity. I wanted to know more. Then I remembered that Emma shared an Instagram account with her colleagues, where they posted photos from corporate events and work meetings. I scrolled through it, and soon came across a shot from the New Year's Eve party at the office, the same one from about 6 weeks ago. There was Emma, smiling, with a glass of champagne in her hand, and Jake was standing next to her, leaning in slightly, as if whispering something in her ear. They looked too close, too comfortable with each other. I zoomed in on the photo, trying to make out the details, but it only made my stomach queasy. Maybe I was winding myself up, but my brain was already drawing pictures I didn't want to see. By noon, I decided to move on. I knew that Emma sometimes left her work papers in the desk drawer in our bedroom, nothing secret, just notes and schedules. I felt like scum going through her stuff, but I couldn't stop now. In the drawer I found a notebook in her handwriting, full of to-do lists and dates. Flipping through the pages, I noticed a few entries from January: meeting with Jake, 6 p.m. M. Presentation with J. Dinner after. J. Office. Discuss details. These could have been work meetings, but the timing and mention of dinner seemed odd to me. Emma never talked about any dinners with colleagues, much less with Jake. I took a picture of the pages on my phone to refer back to later. By evening, I was on edge. Emma got home around 7, tired but in a good mood. She started talking about her day, how she'd been sick in the morning because she was pregnant, and how her colleagues had made fun of her when she'd run out of the room during a meeting. I listened, nodding, but my thoughts were far away. I couldn't get Jake out of my mind. Those texts, the photos, the notes. Finally, when she went to make tea, I dared to ask a question. I tried to sound nonchalant. like it didn't matter. I asked how Jake was doing, mentioning that I hadn't heard from him in a while. Emma froze for a second. It was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Then she shrugged and said he was fine, just busy like everyone else at work. Her voice was steady, but I noticed the way she looked away, concentrating on the kettle a little longer than necessary. That night I didn't sleep again. I lay staring into the darkness, feeling my insides boiling. Her reaction only added fuel to the fire. She was hiding something, I was sure of it. The next day I decided to go to the extreme. I had an old friend, Tom, who worked in IT and had once bragged that he could get almost any information if he wanted it. I rang him up, trying not to go into too much detail, and asked if he could help me check something out. He agreed, though he teased that I seemed to be turning into a detective. I gave him Jake's name and asked him to see what I could find. Nothing specific, just anything I could find. Tom promised to call back in a day or two. As I waited, the tension grew. Emma was behaving as usual, but I began to notice little things I'd missed before. She took her phone to the bathroom more often, sometimes went out on the balcony to breathe, though she'd never done that before. I began to suspect every colleague, every acquaintance she might have crossed paths with. On Thursday night, Tom called back. His voice sounded serious, without the usual jokes. He said he'd found something interesting. Jake had recently updated his status on one of his social media accounts, mentioning that a new chapter of life is about to begin. Nothing specific, but the date of the post was just a week ago. Tom also dug up Jake's old email address and found some shared correspondence, nothing criminal. But there was a glimpse of Emma's name in there in the context of "meet me after work." Tom asked if I wanted to dig deeper, but I said that was enough for now. I needed to digest this. By Friday, I was at my limit. I decided it was time to talk to Emma directly. I couldn't live in this limbo of wondering and suspecting any longer. When she got home, I waited for her to take off her coat and asked her to sit down. My voice was shaking, but I tried to keep it together. I said we needed to talk about the baby. She looked at me with surprise, but sat down, folding her hands in her lap. I started slowly, explaining that I knew I was infertile, that the doctors were sure of it, and that her pregnancy was off the top of my head. I saw her face go pale, her lips pressed together, but I continued. I asked how it was possible and gave her a chance to explain. My voice trailed off when I added that I just wanted the truth, whatever it was. Emma was silent for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. Then she lowered her gaze and said quietly that she didn't know how to explain it. She insisted that she hadn't cheated on me, that it was my baby, but she sounded uncertain, as if she didn't believe it herself. I asked about Jake, and then she flinched. She said he was just a coworker, that there was nothing between them, but I saw her eyes flick up. I didn't yell, didn't accuse, just stared at her, waiting for her to say something that would restore my faith in her, but she remained silent. Finally, I got up and left for the other room, leaving her sitting on the couch. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew one thing: the truth was close, and I wouldn't stop until I knew everything. After that conversation on Friday night, the house began to feel foreign to me. Emma and I no longer talked about the baby, Jake, or anything about that night. She tried to act normal, making breakfast, asking how my day was going, but I could see how tense she was. Her smiles were strained and her movements were overly cautious, like she was afraid of doing something wrong. I pretended everything was fine too, but an emptiness was growing inside me. I couldn't look at her without questioning, and every time she left the room, I felt relieved. I needed space to think, to decide what to do next. But one thing I knew for sure: I couldn't leave things as they were. Saturday morning, I told Emma that I was going to my brother Chris's house for the weekend. It wasn't a complete lie. Chris lived an hour away, and I visited him occasionally to clear my head. She nodded, asking no questions, and I left with a bag containing only the bare essentials. I wasn't actually going to Chris's place. I got a room in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town where no one would look for me. I needed a place where I could gather my thoughts and plan my next move. Sitting on the creaky bed with the faded bedspread, I pulled out my laptop and started overreading messages, looking at photos, studying Emma's notes. I felt obsessed, but I couldn't stop. By late afternoon, I decided it was time to act more decisively. I called Tom again and asked him to dig deeper into Jake. I told him I needed something concrete: the phone calls, the emails, anything that could connect him to Emma. Tom sighed and said it was getting beyond mere curiosity, but agreed to help. He warned me that it would take time, and I said I was willing to wait. While he was working, I decided to do something I had previously avoided: drive to Emma's office. I knew hardly anyone would be there on a Saturday, but I needed to see the place, to get a feel for it, like it could give me answers. I parked across the street from the building and sat in the car, looking out the glass windows. Somewhere in there, Emma spent her days, or maybe her nights, with Jake or someone else. I sat like that for an hour, not noticing anything except the caretaker coming out for a smoke, but that only made me want to know more. On Sunday morning, Tom called back. His voice was quiet, almost guilty. He said he'd found something, but it wasn't what I wanted to hear. Through Jake's old cloud service account, which he'd apparently forgotten to close, Tom had pulled some files. Among them were photos, nothing explicit, but enough to take my breath away. One of them showed Emma and Jake sitting in a restaurant, laughing, their hands too close together. The date on the photo was the end of January, around the time Emma said she got pregnant. There were other photos, the two of them at some corporate event, him putting his arm around her waist, her smiling at him in a way she hadn't smiled at me in a long time. Tom asked if there was anything else I wanted, but I said that was enough. I thanked him and hung up, feeling the world crumble around me. I sat in the motel looking at those pictures on the screen and couldn't breathe. My mind clung to one last hope: maybe it was just friendship, maybe I had it all wrong. But then I remembered her reaction when I'd mentioned Jake, her evasive answers, those late-night texts. It all fit together, and I hated myself for not noticing it sooner. By late afternoon, I decided to head home. I needed to end this, once and for all. I didn't know what I would say, but I knew I couldn't live with her pretending nothing had happened. When I entered the house, Emma was in the living room, watching TV. She looked up and smiled, but the smile disappeared when she saw my face. I didn't waste any time with introductions. I put the printed photos in front of her. Yes, I'd stopped by the copy center on the way, to make it real so she couldn't brush it off. I asked her what it meant. She stared at the pictures, her hands trembling, but she remained silent. I waited, feeling the silence pressing in on me, but she didn't say a word. Finally, I asked bluntly, "Is the baby Jake's?" My voice was hoarse, almost alien. Emma looked up at me, eyes full of tears, and whispered that she hadn't meant for it to turn out this way. She said it was a mistake, that she loved me, that it had only happened once. But I could see that it was a lie, not a one-time thing, not a mistake, but something bigger, something she'd been hiding for months. I didn't scream, I just stared at her, feeling the last 7 years of our lives dissolve into thin air. She tried to take my hand, but I pulled away. I said I needed time and walked away to my bedroom, closing the door. That night I lay on the bed, listening to her quietly crying in the living room, and felt nothing but emptiness. In the morning, I packed my things, not much, just my clothes and laptop, and told her I was leaving. She begged me to stay, saying we could fix things, but I knew it was impossible. I couldn't live with her knowing that the baby wasn't mine, that she was lying to my face. I left without looking back and went to Chris, this time for real. I'm sitting on his couch now, writing this, trying to figure out what to do next. Chris says I need time to figure things out, and he's right, but I can't stop thinking about her, about how it all happened, how I didn't notice. I don't know if I'll file for divorce right away or give myself a couple of weeks to cool off. I don't know if I'll fight for something or just let go. All I know is that my life as I knew it is over, and I have no idea what comes next. It had been a week since I'd left home and moved in with Chris. The days dragged on slowly, each hour filled with silence and thoughts I couldn't get rid of. Chris tried to distract me. He offered to watch football, go to a bar, even tried to drag me fishing, but I refused. I didn't want to be distracted. I needed to get over it, to feel every second of the pain and anger, to figure out how to move on. I sat on his old couch, looking out the window at the bare trees, and tried to put my life back together piece by piece, but nothing was adding up. All I had was emptiness and unanswered questions. Emma called a few times. I didn't pick up the phone, but I listened to the voicemail she left. At first she was crying, begging me to come back, saying she was sorry, that she would do anything to make things right. Then her voice got quieter, more tired. She asked to at least talk, told me I didn't have to see her if I didn't want to. I didn't answer, not because I hated her, though a part of me did hate her, but because I didn't know what to say. All words seemed useless. What could she say to win back my trust? What could I say that wouldn't make me feel crushed? By the end of the week, I decided it was time to do something. I couldn't hide at Chris's forever, living in this suspended reality. I called a lawyer, an old college acquaintance who handled divorces. His name was Dan, and he was straightforward, which was exactly what I needed right now. We met at a coffee shop downtown, and I laid it all out for him: the infertility, the pregnancy, Jake, the photos. I spoke calmly, like I was telling someone else's story, but I was shaking inside. Dan listened, took notes, and then said the case was simple. We didn't have children, at least not mine. Property wasn't hard to divide, and if I wanted, he'd have the paperwork ready in a couple of days. I nodded and told him to get started. It was the first decision I'd made in a while, and it was strangely relieving. That same evening, I texted Emma, short, unemotional, told her I was filing for divorce, that I didn't want to have any conversations, and that she could keep the house. I didn't need it. I sent the text and turned my phone off without waiting for a response. I knew she would cry, probably try to change my mind, but I didn't care. I was tired of being the one trying to understand, the one waiting for explanations. Let her deal with the consequences now. A couple of days later, Dan sent me a draft of the documents. I read them, signed them, and sent them back. Everything was official, cold, like I was signing a contract for a job rather than ending 7 years of marriage. Chris asked if I was sure, and I said I was. There was no doubt, not after everything I'd learned. I didn't want to see Emma, didn't want to hear her excuses. I didn't even want to know what would happen to the baby or to Jake. That wasn't my story anymore. By the end of March, I had found a small flat in a neighboring town. It was nothing special: 1 bedroom, a kitchen, old parquet that creaked under my feet, but it was mine. I moved my stuff there: my laptop, a few boxes of clothes, a couple of books. No photos, no souvenirs from my past life. I wanted to start from scratch, with no reminders of what was. Work helped. I took more orders than usual, stayed up late into the night so I wouldn't be alone with my thoughts. Sometimes I caught myself thinking about Emma, not with longing, but with a kind of cold curiosity. How was she doing? Had she told Jake? But those thoughts were fading fast. They no longer had power over me. This morning I stepped out onto the balcony of my new flat with a cup of coffee in my hand. It was cold, the March wind chilling me to the bone, but I stood there looking out at the city that was beginning to wake up. For the first time in a long time, I felt something resembling peace, not happiness, not relief, just a stillness inside. My life had fallen apart, but I had survived. I lost my wife, my home, the future we had planned, but I'm still here, and that's enough. By the end of March, I had found a small flat in a neighboring town. It was nothing special: 1 bedroom, a kitchen, old parquet that creaked under my feet, but it was mine. I moved my stuff there: my laptop, a few boxes of clothes, a couple of books. No photos, no souvenirs from my past life. I wanted to start from scratch, with no reminders of what was. Work helped. I took more orders than usual, stayed up late into the night so I wouldn't be alone with my thoughts. Sometimes I caught myself thinking about Emma, not with longing, but with a kind of cold curiosity. How was she doing? Had she told Jake? But those thoughts were fading fast. They no longer had power over me. This morning I stepped out onto the balcony of my new flat with a cup of coffee in my hand. It was cold, the March wind chilling me to the bone, but I stood there looking out at the city that was beginning to wake up. For the first time in a long time, I felt something resembling peace, not happiness, not relief, just a stillness inside. My life had fallen apart, but I had survived. I lost my wife, my home, the future we had planned, but I'm still here, and that's enough. The divorce will be finalized in a couple of months when the court approves the papers. I don't know what will happen then. Maybe I'll be alone. Maybe I'll meet someone new someday, but I'm in no hurry. For the first time in a long time, I'm not running for answers, not trying to make things right. I'm just living, day by day, and that's enough for now. The end of this story is not a happy one, but it's mine, and I accept it for what it is.